There's a sentence I've replayed in my head more times than I want to admit. It was said at a dinner table on a Sunday in late October, somewhere between the roast being carved and the wine being poured a second time. My sister-in-law leaned across to a guest I'd just met, smiled the way she smiles when she's about to be cruel in a polite voice, and said, "Oh, don't mind her. She's just a nurse." Then she laughed, and the rest of the table laughed with her. The way people laugh at something that isn't actually funny but feels safe to agree with. I remember the exact moment because I felt my own fork pause halfway to my mouth, and I made the choice, the one I always made, to put it down quietly instead of saying anything. I smiled. I passed the bread. I asked someone about their child's school. But that single sentence stayed in my chest like a small stone, the way certain sentences do when they've been said too many times by too many people who were supposed to love you. And everything I'm about to tell you began collapsing the week after that dinner. My name is Marlene, and at the time of that dinner I was 43 years old, living in a small one-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of Charlotte, North Carolina, with a window that looked out over a parking lot and one very stubborn potted basil plant that refused to die. I'd been a nurse for almost 20 years. I worked at one of the larger teaching hospitals in the city. I had a key card that opened doors most of my family didn't even know existed. And I had a name tag I kept pinned perfectly straight every single morning, because the only person who ever told me that detail mattered was a man who'd been gone 2 years already. Let me tell you a little about the family I grew up in, because none of what comes next will make sense if you don't understand the shape of the room I was standing in. My older brother, Garrett, is a corporate attorney in Atlanta. He has the kind of voice that fills any space he enters, the kind of suit that costs more than most people's rent, and the kind of confidence that's never had to survive being wrong. My younger sister, Whitney, married into a family with the sort of last name people in our city recognize without being told why, and she has spent the years since perfecting the art of casually mentioning her husband's job in any conversation that lasts longer than 4 minutes. My mother, Eleanor, measured people her entire life in titles, degrees, and the photograph she could put on the Christmas card. And my father, the one person who ever truly saw me, passed away 2 years before any of this happened. To this family, my career was something to soften at dinner parties, something to round down, something to mention only if absolutely cornered. I was the daughter people described as, "She's in healthcare," because the actual word sounded too small in their mouths. Before I go any further into this, let me step out of the memory for just a second, because I notice I'm gripping the edge of my own kitchen table while I tell you this. And that's a sign I need a breath. Can I ask you something? Wherever you are right now, whether you're folding laundry, or driving home from a shift, or lying in bed with the lights off, because this is the only quiet hour you get all day, have you ever been the person in your family that everyone underestimated? Has anyone ever called you just something? Just a mom, just a wife, just an assistant, just a nurse. Like that word was supposed to make you smaller. If you have, I'd love for you to tell me in the comments. Just one line. I read them. And if this story finds something in you, you can quietly hit subscribe and stay with me. I won't make a big speech about it. Okay, let me go back. 15 years. That's how long I'd been carrying that word. 15 years of my mother skipping my pinning ceremony, because Garrett had a promotion party the same evening, and we couldn't be in two places, sweetheart. 15 years of Thanksgivings where Whitney would tilt her head and say, "Tell us, are you still playing doctor at that hospital?" And watch to see if I'd flinch. 15 years of being seated at every family event at the end of the table closest to the kitchen, because somewhere along the way it had been decided, without discussion, that the nurse should be the one who got up when someone needed more ice. And then there was the night, 2 years and 3 months ago, when my father was admitted to the cardiac wing of the very hospital I worked at, and I stood at his bedside and quietly noticed that the medication on his chart was wrong by 1 decimal place. A small thing, an easy mistake, the kind of thing that kills people every single day in this country. And I corrected it, calmly, without raising my voice, the way I'd been trained to. My father looked at me from the pillow and squeezed my hand once. And the next morning, while my mother told the visiting relatives that the doctors saved him, I made myself a cup of cafeteria coffee in the hallway and didn't say a word. That was the family I grew up in. And that was the week the phone call came. The Tuesday it started was the kind of morning that gives you no warning at all. I remember the light coming in slanted through the staff locker room window, the smell of someone's burnt toast in the break room, the soft hum of the floor coming awake around me. I'd finished my handover from the night charge nurse, a stable post-op patient in room 412 who'd had a rough night but was finally sleeping, a new admission in 419 whose family was anxious but kind, and an elderly woman in 423 who always asked me to fix her blanket the same exact way, with the corner tucked under her left elbow, because that's how her late husband used to do it. These are the things my family never imagined when they pictured my job. They imagined bedpans and clipboards. They never imagined the small, sacred geometry of a blanket, folded the way someone's grief still asks for it. I had just sat down at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee that was already lukewarm when my supervisor, Diane, walked over. Diane is a woman in her late 50s who has worked at this hospital longer than some of its walls, and she has two settings: warm and direct. That morning she was direct. She said, "Marlene, can I borrow you for a minute?" And the way she said it made the junior nurse next to me look up from her chart. I followed Diane down the corridor to her office, which she closed behind us, which she never does unless something matters. She sat on the edge of her desk instead of behind it. She said, "The board has requested you. Closed door session next Thursday, and then they want you at the recognition event the following week." I waited for her to laugh, because Diane sometimes opens with a joke to soften real news. She didn't laugh. She said, "It's a leadership matter, Marlene. That's all they told me. But I've been here long enough to know what that means." Then she looked at me the way people look at you when they already know something you're about to find out. "I want you to understand what a board summons feels like in a hospital this size. It's not normal. The board doesn't summon floor nurses. The board summons attendings, department heads, sometimes a chief surgeon if there's a crisis." I sat there with my lukewarm coffee in my hand and I felt, for the first time in a long time, that small private flutter you get when something quietly turns in your favor and you're not yet allowed to know what it is. I asked Diane if I was in trouble. She actually did laugh then. She said, "Marlene, you've been many things in this hospital. You have never once been in trouble." I walked back to the station the long way. I needed the extra hallway. And while I walked, I thought about something I rarely let myself think about: the actual shape of what I'd done with my career. The parts my family had never asked a single question about. 10 years ago, I'd noticed a pattern in our floor's medication errors and started, quietly, on my own time, drafting a small protocol about double verification at shift change. It took me 2 years to get it piloted on our unit. It took another 3 to get it adopted hospital-wide. The most recent internal audit had credited that protocol with a measurable reduction in critical incidents. A number that, when I first saw it in the report, made me sit down on the edge of my bed and cry into a dish towel because I had nobody to tell. I'd also finished my master's degree in clinical leadership 2 years earlier, the same year my father died, in night classes nobody in my family ever asked about. I'd been mentoring junior nurses for 9 years. I had references from 3 attending physicians who, if you asked them, would tell you I was the reason their floor functioned. And not one person at my mother's dinner table knew any of that, because every time I'd tried to bring it up in the early years, the conversation had been redirected, gently at first, and then less gently, to Garrett's latest case or Whitney's redecorated dining room. I told myself, walking down that hallway, that I would tell them about the board invitation on Sunday. Not to brag, just to share, because some stubborn part of me, the part that still set an extra place at Thanksgiving for a father who wasn't coming back, still believed that maybe this time would be different. Sunday came. My mother's house smelled like rosemary and furniture polish, the way it always does. Whitney was there with her husband. Garrett had driven up from Atlanta with my sister-in-law, Brett, who is the woman who said the "just a nurse" sentence at the dinner I told you about. I waited until the main course was almost finished. I waited until my mother was in a good mood, refilling water glasses, telling a story she'd told before about a neighbor's renovated kitchen. And then I said, simply, "The hospital board has asked me to attend a recognition event in 2 weeks." I did not say more than that. I wanted to see what they'd do with it before I gave them anything else. Garrett laughed first. He said, "What, like an attendance award?" Whitney smiled into her wineglass and said, "Oh, that's so sweet, Marlene." Brett didn't even look up from her phone. But I saw her thumb tap, and I saw her screen light up with the hospital's public event page, and I watched her save the date. My mother said, "That's nice, dear. Garrett, tell us more about the Henderson deal." And that was the moment, sitting at my mother's table with the candles flickering and the rosemary in the air, that I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. They were going to come. All of them. Because they thought it would be a small ceremony. The kind of thing where their presence would be a generous condescension, the kind of photograph that would look good on Whitney's social media with a caption like, "Supporting my sister tonight." They had no idea what room they were about to walk into. And I decided, very quietly, while my mother passed the gravy, that I wasn't going to tell them. 2 years and 3 months. That's how long my father had been gone. And the anniversary of his passing fell that week. The Wednesday after the Sunday dinner, before the board session, before any of what was coming. I'd been avoiding his study for most of those 2 years. My mother kept the door locked, opening it only to dust, and she'd told me more than once, with that small wounded tone she uses when she wants to control a room, that she couldn't bear to change anything yet. I'd let her have it. Grief asks for strange permissions. But that Wednesday morning, I drove out to her house while she was at her hair appointment, and I let myself in with the key I'd had since I was 16, and I walked down the hallway, and I stood in front of the study door, and I turned the handle. The room smelled the way I remembered. Old paper, cedar, the faintest ghost of his pipe tobacco, even though he'd quit smoking before I was in high school. His reading chair was still angled toward the window the way he liked it. His glasses were still folded on the side table, which broke something small in me that I hadn't expected to break. I knew what I was looking for. About 6 weeks before he died, when his diagnosis had turned from, "We're going to fight this," to, "We're going to be comfortable," my father had pressed a thin manila folder into my hand and said, "Don't open this yet, baby. You'll know when." I'd put it in the back of his bottom desk drawer, the one he always kept locked, and I'd given him the key back, and I'd told him I'd wait. And then he died on a Tuesday in March, and grief had made me a coward about that drawer for 2 years. The key was where he said it would be. Taped to the underside of the drawer above it, a detail only the two of us had ever known. I knelt on the carpet and unlocked the bottom drawer. The folder was there, exactly as I'd left it, and on top of it, in his handwriting, was an envelope with my name on it. Just my first name. No, Marlene Elizabeth. No formal address, just Marlene, the way he used to call me from the bottom of the stairs when I was a child. Inside the folder were 3 things. A signed letter, 2 pages, in his careful slanted handwriting. A legal document, properly executed, witnessed, notarized, establishing a small medical trust in my name, naming me as the sole administrator, designating the funds for under-resourced patients at the very hospital I worked at, and a handwritten note, separate from the letter, that said only this: "You were always the one who understood that medicine is care, not status. Don't let them tell you otherwise. Especially not your mother." I sat on the floor of his study and I read the letter all the way through. And I want to tell you what was in it, but I'm going to save that for later because I read part of it aloud at the event 2 weeks later, and I want you to hear it the way the room heard it. What I will tell you is this: my father had seen everything. He had seen the dinner table seating, he had seen the skipped pinning ceremony, he had seen the playing doctor jokes. He had seen, with the unblinking clarity of a man running out of time, exactly who his children were when he wasn't in the room. The trust was modest by my brother's standards. By mine, it was enormous, not in dollar amount but in meaning, enough to fund the expansion of my safety protocol into a small patient assistance arm. Enough to matter, and legally, completely, mine to direct. I drove home that afternoon and I called my father's estate attorney, Mr. Adiemi. He's an older Nigerian gentleman my father had worked with for almost 30 years, the kind of lawyer who still answers his own phone and remembers the names of your children. He picked up on the second ring. When I told him who I was, he said, "Ah, Marlene. I wondered when you would call." He confirmed everything. The trust was real. The execution was clean. The witnesses had been people from his own firm. And then, gently, he said, "Your father changed the administrator designation about 8 months before he passed. Garrett had been the backup. Your father removed him after a conversation the two of them had. I will not share the contents of that conversation, but I will tell you your father was very calm when he made the change, and very certain." I asked Mr. Adeyemi, if my family knew about the trust. He paused, the way careful lawyers pause. He said, officially no. But your mother has called my office twice in the past year asking general questions about your father's accounts. I answered her, as I am obligated to, only about the publicly settled portions of the estate. Then he said, Marlene, I would advise you to formalize your role as administrator soon, quietly, properly. And if you can align the announcement of this trust with a setting that protects you, that would be wise. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call. I didn't feel angry, I felt. And I want to be honest with you about this. I felt awake. Like a part of me that had been holding its breath for 15 years had finally exhaled. I wasn't going to confront my family. I wasn't going to send a furious text. I wasn't going to write a speech. I was going to do exactly what my father had done. I was going to be calm. I was going to be precise. And I was going to let the room speak for itself. I called Mr. Adeyemi back the next morning and told him I wanted to coordinate the formal activation of the trust with the hospital board's recognition event. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your father would have liked that very much. And I closed my eyes against my kitchen window, and I let myself, for the first time in a very long time, feel proud of being his daughter. The phone call came 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, while I was making eggs. Garrett never calls me. Garrett texts on the rare occasions he communicates at all, and his texts are usually one line, usually about logistics, usually ending in a period that feels like a door closing. So when his name lit up my phone at 9:15 in the morning, I stood very still in front of the stove and let it ring twice before I picked it up. Marlene. His voice was warm. That was the first thing I noticed. Garrett's voice is never warm with me. Hey. How are you? How's everything? I told him I was fine. I asked about his kids. He answered without really answering, the way people do when they're trying to get to the part of the conversation they actually called for. And then, casually, the way you mentioned the weather, he said, hey, listen. I was just thinking. Have you gone through any of Dad's old paperwork? Like his personal stuff? I think there were some files he kept at Mom's, and I wanted to make sure nothing's, gotten lost. I turned off the burner. I said, what kind of files? He laughed, that small laugh he does when he's improvising. Oh, nothing specific. Just, old man stuff, bank things. Maybe some account paperwork. I was talking to my financial guy and he said it's good to be thorough. I waited. I let the silence sit between us. Garrett doesn't like silence. It makes him fill the space, and people fill space with what's actually on their mind. He said, have you been over to Mom's? Like, looking through his study or anything. And there it was, the reason for the call. I told him very calmly that I'd been to Mom's for the anniversary, that I'd sat in Dad's chair for a few minutes, that I hadn't touched anything. The lie sat in my mouth easily, which surprised me. I'd been raised not to lie. But I'd also been raised, apparently, to be called just a nurse, at dinner parties, and somewhere between those two upbringings, a small adjustment had occurred in me that I hadn't realized until that moment. He said, okay, cool. Just wanted to check. Hey, we should all get together soon. Family thing. I'll talk to Mom. And he hung up. I stood in my kitchen with cold eggs in the pan and I understood, with absolute clarity, that someone had been talking. Either my mother had told him about her calls to Mr. Adeyemi's office, or my mother had noticed that the locked drawer in the study was now unlocked, or, and this is the one that sat heaviest in me, Garrett had always known, on some level, that something existed, and the board invitation had been the thing that finally pushed him to act. I drove to my mother's house that afternoon under the pretense of returning a casserole dish. She was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, arranging flowers for a luncheon she was hosting on Monday. The house was full of that particular performative cleanliness she puts on when she's anxious. I made small talk. I admired the flowers. And as I set the casserole dish on the counter, I saw it, a half-written list in her handwriting, on a notepad next to the phone. Names. Family members. Figures next to some of the names. And at the bottom of the list, in slightly different ink, like she'd come back to it later, Marlene. She saw me see it. She moved, smoothly but quickly, and slid a magazine over the notepad. She said, sweetheart, would you like some tea? Her voice was bright in a way her voice gets when she's covering something. I told her no, I had to get going. I had a shift. I kissed her cheek. I walked out to my car. And I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before I started the engine, because my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the very specific anger that comes from confirming a suspicion you'd been hoping was wrong. The third sign came on Monday morning in the form of a text from Brett, my sister-in-law. The just a nurse, woman. Her text was long, friendly, full of emojis, and the tone was so unlike her that it set off every alarm I have. She wrote that she'd been thinking about how hard it must be for me to handle all of Dad's leftover stuff alone, and that she and Garrett would love to come over some weekend and help organize. She used the phrase, settle anything outstanding. She used the phrase, make sure everyone's on the same page. She used the word, transparency. Brett has never, in 15 years of marriage to my brother, used the word, transparency, in a sentence to me. I forwarded the text to Mr. Adiemi without comment. He called me back within the hour. He said, Marlene, I want to be very clear. Do not sign anything they put in front of you. Do not agree to any informal family meeting where documents are present. Do not allow any of them into your apartment unattended. If they call a meeting, you may attend, but you will not attend alone, and you will not attend without notice to me. Is that understood? I told him it was. He said, good, and one more thing. Document everything from this point forward. Every call, every text, every conversation. Date and time. You don't have to do anything with it. You just need to have it. I told him I would. Then he said, more softly, your father anticipated this, Marlene. He told me, the last time we met, that the moment you came into your own, your family would suddenly remember you existed. He was sorry about that. He wanted you to know he was sorry. I sat with that for a long time. The idea that my father, in the last months of his life, had known exactly what was going to happen, and had spent his final energy not on rage but on preparation, on building me a quiet, legal, witnessed kind of armor, broke something open in me that I didn't know was still closed. That Thursday, Garrett called again. This time my mother was on the line too. They had organized a small family conversation for Saturday at her house. Garrett said it would be casual. My mother said it would be good for everyone to clear the air. Whitney would be there. Brett would be there. They'd ordered lunch. They said it like it was a party, but the word, conversation, was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and we all knew it. I told them I was scheduled to work that Saturday. Garrett's voice changed instantly. He said, Marlene, this is important. I said, in the same even tone I use when I'm telling a family that we've done everything we can for their loved one. So is my shift. There was a long silence on the line. Then my mother said, well, we'll miss you. And she hung up first. Later that night, she sent a voice note. It was 4 minutes long. I listened to it once. I made a cup of tea. I wrote down the date and the time. I did not respond. The recognition event was in 11 days. The family conversation was in 6. And I had already decided, sitting in my mother's driveway 2 days earlier, that I was not going to walk into a room they had arranged. I was going to wait. And when the room came, it was going to be mine. The week before the board event was strange in a way I didn't have words for at the time. There was a quiet around me, the kind that settles in when something big is approaching, and your body knows it before your mind does. I worked my shifts. I drank my coffee. I tucked Mrs. Halloran's blanket the way she liked it. And I noticed, on Tuesday, that her hands were a little colder than they had been the day before. And I made a note in her chart and flagged it for the attending. These are the small, invisible acts that make up a nursing life. Nobody writes a Christmas card about them. On Wednesday, a junior nurse I'd been mentoring for the past 2 years. Her name was Tomi, 26 years old, sharp as a blade and kind in a way that's becoming rare in this profession, knocked on the door of the little office Diane had given me for protocol work. Tommy sat down across from me and said, I wanted to thank you for last week. The week before, we'd had a complicated case. A young patient, a missed allergy, a near miss that became a not miss because Tommy caught it. She'd come to me afterward shaking, certain she'd made the wrong call somewhere in the chain. I'd walked her through it. I'd shown her the chart. I'd shown her where the failure had actually been, 2 links upstream of her. And I'd told her, the way someone had once told me when I was 26 and shaking in a stairwell, that the goal wasn't to be a nurse who never felt afraid. The goal was to be a nurse whose fear made her more careful, not less. Tommy told me she was coming to the recognition event. She said, wouldn't miss it for the world. She said it the way people say it when they mean it. And I realized, sitting across from her in that small office with the bad fluorescent light, That I had spent so many years being unseen by the people who were supposed to see me that I had nearly missed the fact that I was being seen, every single day, by people I'd taught to look. That was its own kind of inheritance. My father would have understood that. That night, alone in my apartment, with my basil plant on the windowsill and a single lamp on, I took out my father's letter and I read it aloud, all the way through, for the first time. I don't cry easily. I work in a profession that asks you not to. But I cried that night. Not the loud kind, the other kind, the kind that just leaks out of you while you're sitting very still. He had written about the day I was born. He had written about the day I told him I wanted to be a nurse, and he had been the only one in the family who hadn't tried to talk me out of it. He had written about my mother. Carefully, kindly, but truthfully. About her need to be admired and how it had cost her the daughter she could have had if she'd been brave enough to look. He had written about Garrett and Whitney without bitterness, just clarity. And he had written, at the end, a single line that I want to share with you now because it's the line I decided I would read aloud at the event. He wrote, "The world is full of people who confuse loudness with worth. You, my daughter, were never one of them. Don't start now." I folded the letter back into its envelope. I went to sleep without setting an alarm, and I slept through the night for the first time in months. Thursday morning, my mother called. I had been expecting it. She used the voice she uses when she's about to ask for something while pretending to ask about your day. She wanted to know how I was. She wanted to know if I'd been eating. She wanted to know, and this took her about 11 minutes to get to, whether I'd had a chance to think about what Garrett had been going through lately. His firm, apparently, had been restructuring. There was a possibility of a pay reduction. Nothing serious, she said quickly, but she let the "but" hang there. Then she said, "Your father had some accounts, didn't he? From the old days. Things he set aside. I just thought, if there was anything that could help your brother through this transition, family is family." I let her finish. I did not interrupt her once. When she was done, I said, "Mom, everything Dad set aside is being handled properly, in the right place, by the right people. I don't want you to worry about it." There was a long pause. She said, "What does that mean, Marlene?" I said, "It means exactly what I said." And I waited. I have learned, in 20 years of nursing, that you can hold a silence longer than almost anyone you're related to, if you train yourself to. My mother eventually said, "Well, I just hope you'll do the right thing." I told her I always had, and we hung up. Friday, I did almost nothing. I did the laundry. I took a walk. I ordered a car for Saturday morning because I didn't want to deal with parking at the event. I picked out the dress I would wear. Navy blue, simple, nothing that announced itself. I polished my work shoes because I'd decided I would wear them instead of heels. They were the shoes I'd stood in for 10,000 shifts. They had earned the stage. Saturday morning came. I woke up at 6. I drank coffee at the kitchen table while it was still dark outside. I read my father's letter one more time, the parts of it that weren't for anyone but me. I put on the navy dress. I pinned my ID badge straight, the way I always did, on the left side, level with my collarbone. I tucked the trust paperwork into a slim leather folder I'd bought for the occasion. And at 7:45, my phone buzzed. It was Brett. Her message said, "We'll all be there. Save us seats near the front." I looked at the message for a long moment, and then I typed back, perfectly politely, of course. "See you there." I ordered the car. I locked my apartment, and I walked out into a morning that didn't yet know what it was about to become. The atrium of the hospital looks different on event days. They roll out the long banners, the ones with the institutional logo, and the soft watercolor photographs of patients who agreed to be photographed. They set out chairs in long curved rows facing the small stage. They put pitchers of water on white linen tables. And they place, near the entrance, a board with the names of the people being recognized that day. I had asked, through Diane, that my name not be on the entrance board. I wanted it kept for the screen inside. The board chairman had agreed. My family arrived together. I was already there, standing toward the back near the coffee station, talking to two of my colleagues from the protocol committee. I saw them come through the front doors the way you see weather coming through a window. My mother in cream silk, pearls, the lipstick she only wore for events she planned to be photographed at. Whitney in something pale green and expensive, her husband 2 steps behind her, already looking at his phone. Garrett in a charcoal suit, scanning the room the way he scans every room. looking for the most important person to greet first. And Brett, in a dress I knew she had bought specifically for that day, with her phone already in her hand, already filming. They didn't see me at first. I watched them work the room. I watched Brett take a selfie in front of the donor wall. I watched Garrett shake the hand of a man he did not know, introducing himself with that firm, fast handshake he uses on partners at his firm. I watched Whitney touch the arm of a nurse, not one of mine, just a nurse, any nurse, and say something I couldn't hear but could read on the nurse's face. The nurse smiled politely. The nurse looked across the room at me. We made eye contact for a brief, electric second. The nurse looked away, and I saw her press her lips together to keep from smiling. My mother spotted me. She crossed the room with that practiced, fluttering speed she uses when she's claiming territory. Sweetheart, there you are. We've been looking everywhere. Come, come, sit with us. She hooked her arm through mine. Garrett joined us, clapping me on the shoulder, saying loudly, to anyone within earshot, "Yeah, this is my sister, our little nurse. They're giving her something today. It's very sweet." Two of my colleagues from the protocol committee glanced at each other. One of them, Dr. Henley, who had championed my work to the board, took a slow sip of his coffee and said absolutely nothing. I have loved that man quietly for 10 years for moments exactly like that one. He could have spoken. He chose not to. He let it sit. I let my mother lead me toward the front rows. I let Brett photograph me. I let Whitney straighten the collar of my dress. I gave them, in those last few minutes, exactly the version of me they expected, because I knew that the more they had of that version stored up in their minds, the harder the next 10 minutes were going to land. The board chairman stepped to the podium at 10 o'clock exactly. His name was Dr. Whitfield, a cardiologist in his mid-60s, the kind of man who has spent his whole life learning when to use few words and when to use many. He began by thanking the staff, the patients, the families. He gave a brief overview of the hospital's year. Then he said, "Today we're recognizing someone whose work has fundamentally changed the way our institution protects its patients. 10 years ago, a nurse on one of our floors noticed a pattern the rest of us had missed. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for a committee. She drafted a protocol on her own time, piloted it on her own unit, and over the course of nearly a decade, has seen that protocol adopted as the institutional standard across every floor of this hospital." I felt my mother shift beside me. She was still smiling, but the smile had become slightly fixed, the way it does when she's hearing a sentence she didn't expect. Dr. Whitfield continued. "The most recent internal audit credits this protocol with a 38% reduction in critical medication errors hospital-wide. That number, in plain language, means lives. Many of them. People who are alive today because of one nurse's discipline, one nurse's persistence, and one nurse's refusal to accept that things had to remain the way they were." He paused. "It is my privilege today to recognize her not only for that work, but to announce that the board has unanimously appointed her to a newly created position, Head of Patient Safety, effective at the start of next month. Please welcome Marlene Holloway, Senior Clinical Nurse Specialist, our new Head of Patient Safety." My name went up on the screen behind him. Full name, title underneath, the new title underneath that. The room applauded. It was real applause, the kind that comes from people who actually know what the words on the screen mean. I stood up. My mother's hand was still on my arm. I felt her fingers go slack. I did not look at her. I did not look at Garrett. I did not look at Brett, whose phone, I noticed in my peripheral vision, was now lowered to her side. I walked to the stage. I climbed the 3 steps. I shook Dr. Whitfield's hand. I turned to the room. I had not prepared a long speech. I'd written 3 sentences on an index card the night before, and I'd put the card in the slim leather folder along with my father's letter and the trust paperwork. I took the card out. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I had expected them to shake. I said, "Thank you. To my colleagues, to Dr. Henley, to Diane, to the nurses who let me try things on their floors when I had no authority and only an idea. Thank you. To the patients who trusted us when we asked them to try a new verification step. Thank you. And to my father, who is not here today, but who told me, a long time ago, that medicine is care, not status. I hear you." I paused. I let the room settle. I said, "I'd also like to use this moment to announce that, in coordination with the hospital, and with the assistance of my father's estate, I will be activating a small medical trust in his name, The trust will fund medication assistance for patients on our protocol who cannot afford their post-discharge prescriptions. Details will be available through the hospital's patient services office next week. Thank you. The applause came back, louder. Dr. Whitfield nodded at me. A small, deliberate nod that told me he had known the trust announcement was coming, because Mr. Adeyemi had coordinated with him, because my father had built this room 10 years before I knew I was going to walk into it. I stepped down from the stage. I did not return to the seat next to my mother. I walked, instead, to the back of the room, where Tommy was standing, and where she reached out without a word and squeezed my hand once. The way my father used to. They cornered me in the hallway outside the atrium, before I had even reached the corridor that led to the administrative wing. I had been expecting it. I had told Mr. Adeyemi exactly where I would be, and at what time, and he had told me he would be waiting in the small private meeting room at the end of that corridor, with the door cracked open, with the documents on the table, with a pot of coffee that nobody was going to drink. Garrett got to me first. He moved fast for a man in a charcoal suit. He took my elbow, not roughly, but firmly, the way he takes the elbow of a junior associate he wants to redirect. He said low, under his breath, "Marlene." What trust? What was that up there? What trust? My mother arrived 2 seconds later, slightly out of breath, her cream silk crumpling slightly at the waist where she'd been gripping it. She said, "Sweetheart, why didn't we know about this? Why are we hearing about your father's accounts in a public room?" Whitney appeared behind them, eyes wide, doing the math in real time. Brett had her phone out again, low against her hip, and I could see, from the angle of her hand, that she had begun recording. I did not pull my arm out of Garrett's grip. I let him hold it. I said very quietly, "There's a room at the end of this hallway. Mr. Adeyemi is in it. If you'd like to discuss this, we can discuss it there." Properly. Garrett blinked. The name landed on him the way certain names land on lawyers. He let go of my arm. My mother said, Mr. Adeyemi is here." I said, "Yes." Her hand went to her pearls. We walked. The meeting room was small and well lit, with a long table and 6 chairs and a window that looked out over the hospital's small interior courtyard, where a maintenance worker was repotting a hydrangea. Mr. Adeyemi stood when we came in. He was in his late 60s, slim, in a perfectly pressed gray suit, with the kind of calm that comes from a career of telling rich people things they did not want to hear. He greeted my mother first. "Eleanor, it's been some time." And then my brother. He did not greet Brett, who hovered in the doorway with her phone still in her hand until Mr. Adeyemi looked at her, just looked at her, and said, "Recordings of confidential legal discussions on hospital premises are not permitted. I'm gonna have to ask you to put that away." She put it away. We sat. Mr. Adeyemi opened a leather portfolio. He took out 3 documents. He laid them face up on the table. He said, "Eleanor, Garrett, Whitney, I want to be very clear about what these documents are, because I think there has been some confusion, and confusion of this kind tends to produce unfortunate behavior." He used the word unfortunate, the way a surgeon uses the word complication. Then he walked them through it. The trust was established by my father 18 months before his death. It was executed in the presence of 2 witnesses from Mr. Adeyemi's firm. It was notarized. It named me as sole administrator. The funds were designated for a specific purpose, in coordination with my hospital. It was, in every legal sense available, airtight. He paused. He looked at Garrett. He said, "Garrett, you had previously been named as the backup administrator. Your father removed that designation approximately 8 months before his passing, following a private conversation between the 2 of you. I will not share the contents of that conversation, but your father's instructions on the change were unambiguous." Garrett did not move. He did not look at me. He looked at the document in front of him, and I watched his jaw work the way it works when he's deciding how much it is worth it to fight a thing in front of witnesses. He decided it wasn't. He said, "I see." That was all he said. My mother began to cry, not loudly, quietly, the way she cries when she's reaching for an effect. She said, "Marlene, sweetheart, why would your father do this without telling me? Why would he hide this from his own family? We're a family, baby. Family should share." She reached across the table for my hand. I did not give it to her. I said, "And I want you to know that I had not rehearsed this. Because I had decided I wasn't going to rehearse it, because I had decided I would say what came when it came." I said, "Mom, we are a family." Dad believed that. So do I. But family shares dignity first, not money. dignity, and for 15 years in this family, I have not been shared with. I have been used. I have been seated at the end of the table. I have been called just a nurse, in front of strangers by women whose names I had to memorize at weddings I was barely invited to. I missed my own pinning ceremony in your memory because you weren't there for it. I corrected Dad's medication chart in the cardiac ward 2 years ago and listened to you tell the relatives the doctors saved him. I have been the daughter who got up to get more ice. And I have done all of it without complaint, because I loved my father, and because some part of me kept hoping that one day you would look at me and see what he saw. The room was very quiet. Mr. Adiyami was looking at the table. Whitney was looking at her hands. Garrett was looking finally at me. I said, Dad saw me. He's the reason I'm sitting in this room with my own attorney instead of in your living room signing a document Brett drafted on her laptop. He saw exactly what was going to happen the moment I came into my own. So no, Mom, I'm not going to apologize for the trust. I'm not going to share it with Garrett's firm restructuring. I'm not going to redirect it to make any of you more comfortable. It's going to do exactly what Dad asked it to do, and I'm going to do exactly what Dad asked me to do, which is not let any of you tell me otherwise. My mother's tears stopped. That was the most telling thing. They stopped, mid-sentence, the way they do when the performance hasn't landed and there's no point continuing it. She sat back. She said, I see. Then she said, well, then she did not say anything else. There was a soft knock at the door. A young woman from hospital security, polite, professional, in a navy blazer, stepped in. She looked at Brett. She said, Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt. I've been asked to inform you that filming was observed in the restricted corridor on the way in. Our policy requires that any such footage be deleted in the presence of a staff member. Would you mind stepping out with me for a moment? Brett went red. She did not look at Garrett. She did not look at me. She stood up and followed the woman out. I did not smile. I did not allow myself even the small private satisfaction of a held breath. I thanked the security officer by name as she left. Patricia, 28 years old, a single mother of two, the kind of woman my father would have made a point of remembering. As they walked out, Dr. Whitfield passed in the hallway. He glanced into the room. He did not stop. He simply nodded at me, once, the same nod he had given me from the stage, and continued on. My family filed out behind Brett. My mother last. She paused in the doorway. She looked at me. She opened her mouth as if to say something. She closed it again. She left. Mr. Adeyemi gathered the documents back into his portfolio. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, Your father would have been very proud of you today, Marlene. I said, Thank you. He said, He told me you would handle it like this. I did not entirely believe him. I should have. And he stood, and he buttoned his jacket, and he walked me out into the corridor, where the late morning light was coming in through the tall windows, and where the hospital, my hospital, was going about its ordinary, sacred business around us. I drove home alone that afternoon. The car the hospital had ordered for me was waiting at the front entrance, but I waved it off. I wanted my own car. I wanted the windows down. I wanted the long way home, the one that goes past the old neighborhood where my father used to take me for ice cream on Sundays after church, before any of us were old enough to be cruel to each other yet. I didn't cry on the drive. I thought I might. I'd built myself up for it. But the tears didn't come. What came instead was a quiet I hadn't felt in 15 years. A quiet that wasn't the quiet of being unseen, but the quiet of finally being still. I thought about a patient I'd had in my second year of nursing, an elderly man recovering from a hip replacement, who had reached up from his bed one morning and called me, Doctor. By accident. I'd corrected him gently, I'm your nurse, Mr. Halloran. And he'd smiled at me and said, Even better, sweetheart. I'd forgotten about that until that drive home. Funny how the right memory finds you on the right day. The title had never needed defending. I understood that now in a way I hadn't understood that morning. The title was fine. The title had always been fine. What had needed defending, what I had failed to defend for 15 years, was the woman wearing it. And I had finally done that, in a small meeting room with a hydrangea outside the window, with my father's attorney as my witness, in the calmest voice I had ever used in my mother's presence. I got home a little after 1. My phone, which had been on silent all morning, was lit up like a Christmas tree. 16 messages from Garrett, 11 from my mother, 4 from Whitney, 1 oddly from Brett which simply said I'm sorry. I read them all once. I did not reply to any of them that day. I want to be clear about something. I was not punishing them. Punishment requires energy I did not have to give. I was simply done performing availability for people who had never once shown up for mine. There is a difference. The difference is everything. I made myself a sandwich. I sat at my kitchen table. I watered the basil. I called Mr. Adayami to thank him again, and he told me that he had already filed the formal activation paperwork that morning, and that the trust would be operational by Monday. He told me, before he hung up, that he had known my father for 31 years, and that of all the cases he had handled in that time, this one had brought him the deepest satisfaction. I told him my father would have said the same about him. We both knew it was true. Before I keep going, let me pause for a second, because I notice this is the part of the story where I usually want to rush, to get to the neat ending, and I don't want to rush it for you. I want to ask you something. If you've made it this far with me, and I know you have, because you're still here, I want to know, has there been a moment in your own life when you finally stopped explaining yourself to people who were never going to listen? When you finally walked out of a room you'd been performing in for years? You don't have to share the whole story. Even one line is enough. I read every comment, even the short ones, even the ones that just say me too. And if anything in this story has reached you, you can quietly subscribe and stay with me. I'm not going anywhere. All right, back to it. Monday morning, the trust funded its first patient. Her name was Renata. She was 29 years old, a young mother of two, recovering from an emergency appendectomy with complications. She had been about to be discharged without a critical post-operative antibiotic because her insurance had denied the coverage on a technicality, and she could not afford the out-of-pocket cost. The discharge nurse had flagged it. The flag had reached the patient services office. The patient services office had called my new office, which was still being painted, and asked if the new fund was operational yet. I had told them yes. I had walked the paperwork through myself. I went to see Renata before she left. I didn't introduce myself by my new title. I didn't mention the fund. I just stopped by her room the way I stopped by any patient's room. And I asked her how she was feeling, and I made sure she had the prescription in her hand before she was wheeled out. She thanked me. I told her to take care of herself. I watched her go. And then I walked back to my floor, and Tommy, who had heard, because nurses always hear, just looked at me and smiled and went back to her chart. That was all I needed. That was the whole thing. 2 weeks later, my mother asked to meet for coffee. I almost said no. I'd been doing well, sleeping through the night, eating actual meals, opening the windows in my apartment in the mornings the way I used to before grief made me stop. But there was something in her voice on the phone that was different. Not performance, not theater. Something tired. So I said yes. We met at a small place near the university neutral ground, neither of our usual spots. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table by the window, no makeup, her hair pulled back simply, looking, and I had not seen this in her for years, looking her age. She stood when I came in. She did not try to hug me. She gestured to the chair across from her I sat. She said, "I didn't realize how much of your life I never asked about." That was her opening sentence. No preamble. No softening. Just that. She said, "I have been thinking, since that day, about every dinner we had, and every Christmas, and every birthday. And I cannot remember a single conversation I had with you about your work. I cannot remember asking you about your master's degree. I cannot remember asking you why you stopped coming to Sunday dinners for that year. Which, I am realizing now, was the year you were finishing your thesis." She looked at me. She said, "I do not know my own daughter. And I am the reason for that." I let her say it. I did not rescue her. I did not say, "It's okay, Mum," the way I had said it 1,000 times before in 1,000 smaller moments. Because it wasn't okay. And rescuing her from that sentence would have been the most familiar form of disrespect I knew how to do. Disrespect to her, and to myself, and to the years that had built that sentence. I said, "Thank you for saying that." She nodded. I said, "I'm not going to pretend the last 15 years didn't happen. I can't. But I'm willing to see what the next 15 could look like. If you mean it." She said she meant it. We drank our coffee. We talked about small things, her garden, my apartment, an old neighbor of ours who had moved to Florida. We did not talk about Garrett. We did not talk about the trust. We did not talk about the meeting room. When she stood to leave, she touched my hand once, briefly, the way she used to when I was very small. She said, Your father would be proud of you, Marlene. I hope you know that. I said, I know. And I let her go. I want to tell you something before this story ends. I want to tell you what I'd say to anyone who has been called just something. Just a mother, just a wife, just a secretary, just a waitress, just a nurse, just a daughter who didn't go to college, just a son who chose a quieter life. The word just is almost always spoken by people who could not do what you do. People who do not know the geometry of a blanket folded the way someone's grief asks for it. People who have never noticed a medication chart off by one decimal place. People who have never sat with a patient through the long second hour of a night that might be their last. The word, just, is a confession by the person saying it. It tells you what they can't see. It does not tell you what you are. I closed up my new office on a Thursday evening, the one with the freshly painted walls, and the small plaque beside the door that read Marlene Holloway, RN, MSN, Head of Patient Safety. I locked the drawer where I kept my father's letter, folded neatly in its original envelope, the way he'd given it to me. The corridor light was soft. The hospital was settling into its evening rhythm, the way hospitals do, the way they have for as long as there have been hospitals. I turned the key. I stood there for a moment. I was no longer the punchline at anyone's dinner table. I was, finally, simply myself. And I walked out into the rest of my life.